The discordant clang of metal on reinforced alloy shattered the cathedral-like silence of the vault. Alistair Blackwood, a man whose net worth eclipsed the GDP of several small nations, swore, the sound raw and guttural, in the chilled, sterile air. He slammed his fist against the obsidian monolith that was his safe, a pointless act of frustration that sent a sharp, stinging pain up his arm. The safe, a custom-built titan of German engineering, remained impassive, its seamless face mocking him with a single, unblinking red light. "Open!" Alistair growled, his voice tight with a rising panic that felt alien and degrading. He pressed his thumb against the biometric scanner again. "Access denied." He recited the 16-digit alphanumeric passphrase, his enunciation perfect despite the tremor in his hands. Access denied. He even submitted to the retinal scan, the laser tracing the intricate map of his eye. Access denied. It was impossible. This vault, his inner sanctum, was designed to be impregnable from the outside, but effortlessly accessible to him. It was his digital fortress, his financial soul, and it had just locked him out. A cold sweat beaded on his forehead. Inside that vault wasn't just bearer bonds or gold bullion. It contained the single proof of ownership for his entire empire, a digital key so critical that its loss would mean the unraveling of his life's work. The market would open in 6 hours. And Alistair Blackwood, the master of the universe, was utterly, terrifyingly helpless. He was a king locked out of his own kingdom, and the walls were starting to feel like they were closing in, the silence amplifying the frantic drumming of his heart against his ribs. The red light pulsed, a steady, malevolent heartbeat, counting down to his ruin. The first call was to Herr Müller, the safe's creator in Munich, a man whose arrogance was matched only by his genius. Alistair barked down the secure line, the frantic edge in his voice thinly veiled by a lifetime of practiced authority. Müller, woken from a deep sleep, was initially dismissive. "Impossible, Mr. Blackwood. The Centurion is flawless. It is more likely you have forgotten the protocol." Alistair's retort was laced with ice. "I have not forgotten 3 separate biometric and password protocols, Klaus. I am standing in front of your flawless machine, and it is a very expensive, very inert block of metal. Get your team on a jet, now." The click of the phone was a gunshot in the tomb-like vault. Next was his head of security, a former Mossad agent named Kalin, who moved with a disquieting silence. Kalin arrived within minutes, his face a mask of professional calm that did little to soothe Alistair's frayed nerves. He ran diagnostics, his fingers flying across a tablet connected to the safe's external port. The results were as baffling as they were infuriating. "No signs of tampering, sir. No electronic footprint of an attempted breach. The system reports it is functioning perfectly. It simply refuses to recognize you." Kalin's gaze was steady, but a flicker of unease danced in his eyes. "It's as if the safe has decided you are no longer its owner." The words hung in the air, absurd and yet chillingly accurate. As the morning sun began to filter through the armored shutters of Alistair's penthouse office, the room filled with a coterie of the world's best locksmiths, safecrackers, and cybersecurity experts, a veritable rogues gallery of talent summoned by the sheer gravitational pull of Alistair's wealth. They worked with quiet, intense focus, their tools and laptops spread across the Persian rug like surgical instruments. They tried thermal lances that hissed against the alloy, magnetic resonance scanners that hummed with impotent energy, and algorithms that hammered against the firewall, only to be repelled without a trace. Nothing worked. The Centurion was a black hole, absorbing all their efforts and giving nothing back. The red light continued its steady, maddening pulse. Alistair paced the room like a caged panther, his bespoke suit feeling like a straitjacket. He was a man accustomed to bending the world to his will, to problems being solved with a phone call and an astronomical wire transfer. But this was different. This was a rebellion of the inanimate, a mutiny of ones and zeros. He watched the experts confer in hushed tones, their faces etched with a mixture of professional embarrassment and genuine awe at the safe's resilience. They were the best, and they were failing. The market would open in 2 hours. Whispers were already starting to circulate on the trading floors, rumors of a glitch in the Blackwood Industries network, a tremor in the foundation of his empire. His stock was already dipping in pre-market trading. He could feel the vultures circling. His world, so meticulously constructed, was teetering on the brink of collapse because of a stubborn piece of German engineering. In the midst of this controlled chaos, a new figure appeared at the edge of the room, almost unnoticed. It was Maria, his housekeeper, a woman who had been a quiet, almost invisible presence in his life for the past decade. She stood hesitantly, her hands wringing the fabric of her uniform, her face a portrait of worry. Beside her, clutching her hand, was a small girl, no older than 7, with wide, curious brown eyes that took in the scene with a solemn gravity. This was Maria's granddaughter, Maya. Alistair had only seen her in passing, a fleeting splash of color in the monochrome palette of his life. Maria had been forced to bring her to work today. The girls' school was closed for a teachers' conference. Alistair's first instinct was to snap, to order them out of his sight. The presence of a child felt like a profanity in this temple of high-stakes finance and desperate technology. But he was too exhausted, too consumed by his own powerlessness to summon the energy for anger. He just shot them a withering glare and turned back to the safe, a monument to his impending doom. The hours bled into one another, each tick of the grandfather clock in the hall a hammer blow against Alistair's sanity. The stock market had opened, and the initial dip in his company's shares had become a precipitous plunge. News outlets, smelling blood, were running speculative headlines. Blackwood Empire in turmoil? Mystery glitch paralyzes global titan. His phone buzzed incessantly with calls from board members, investors, and rivals, a chorus of panic and schadenfreude he couldn't bring himself to answer. He felt a primal fear he hadn't experienced since he was a penniless orphan fighting for scraps on the street. It was the terror of losing everything, the icy grip of absolute vulnerability. He had built his empire to escape that feeling, to construct a fortress of wealth so high and so thick that nothing could ever touch him again. Yet here he was, brought to his knees by a machine. The experts had finally admitted defeat. They stood before him, a collection of humbled geniuses, their faces grim. "Mr. Blackwood," one of them began, his voice heavy with resignation, "we've exhausted every option short of a tactical nuclear device. The alloy is impenetrable. The electronics are a closed loop. We can't hack it without the system recognizing the intrusion and wiping the internal drives clean. We can't open it." Alistair felt the floor drop out from under him. He stared at the safe, this mausoleum of his success, and for the first time he felt a wave of utter despair wash over him. He sank into his leather armchair, the fight draining out of him, leaving a hollow ache in its place. The room was thick with the stench of failure. It was in this moment of profound silence and defeat that a small voice, clear as a bell, piped up. "Maybe it's just sad." Alistair's head snapped up. All eyes turned to the source of the voice. It was the little girl, Maya, who was now standing a few feet away from the safe, her head tilted in contemplation. She had let go of her grandmother's hand and had been quietly observing the proceedings, her expression one of intense concentration. Maria rushed forward, her face flushed with mortification. "Maya, be quiet. I am so sorry, Mr. Blackwood. She—" Alistair raised a hand, silencing her. He was too broken to be angry. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. Maya looked at him, unafraid. "The light is red," she said, pointing a small finger at the pulsing indicator. "Red means stop, or angry, or sad. My nightlight turns red when I have a bad dream. Maybe the safe is having a bad dream." The cybersecurity expert, a young man with a sleeve of tattoos and a PhD from MIT, let out a snort of derision before catching Alistair. Air's glare and falling silent. The other men shuffled their feet, embarrassed by the childish interruption, but Alistair just stared at the girl. Her logic was absurd, a child's fantasy imposed on a marvel of modern technology. Yet, in the utter absence of any rational solution, her words held a strange, almost hypnotic power. Sadness. A machine feeling sadness. It was the most ridiculous thing he had ever heard. And yet... He thought of the protocols, thumbprint, his identity, passphrase, his intellect, retinal scan, his vision, all aspects of him, his physical and mental being, rejected, as if the safe knew him and was displeased. "What would you do?" Alistair found himself asking, his voice barely audible. "To make your nightlight happy again?" Maya's face brightened, as if this was the most obvious question in the world. "I sing to it," she said, "and I tell it a story, a happy one. And then I tell it a secret, a really good one, so it doesn't feel lonely." She took a tentative step closer to the safe, her small hand reaching out towards its cold, black surface. "What's its name?" she asked. Alistair blinked. "It doesn't have a name. It's a safe." "Everything has a name," Maya insisted gently. "How can you tell it a secret if you don't know its name?" The question was so simple, so profoundly illogical, yet it struck a chord deep inside Alistair. He had never thought of the safe as anything other than an object, a tool. It had no identity beyond its function. But now, in his desperation, he started to see it differently. It was the guardian of his life's work, the heart of his kingdom. He had poured all of his secrets into it, both corporate and personal. In a way, it knew him better than any living person. He looked at the pulsing red light, and for a fleeting moment Maya's words didn't seem so crazy. It did look like a sad, lonely eye. What was its name? He had commissioned it, overseen its design, but he'd never christened it. It was just the Centurion, a brand name, a name without soul. He remembered a fleeting conversation with Muller during the design phase. Muller had joked about the safe's AI, how it learned its owner's patterns, how it was so advanced it practically had a personality. Alistair had dismissed it as marketing fluff. Now, he wasn't so sure. He looked at Maya, this tiny child in a room full of defeated men, and a desperate, insane idea began to form in his mind. An idea born of the ashes of logic and reason. "Let the girl try," Alistair said. his voice ringing with a newfound, albeit fragile, authority. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the assembled experts. Kalen, his security chief, stepped forward. "Sir, with all due respect, this is not a playground. We are dealing with a multi-layered quantum encryption system. A child cannot possibly—" "Have you opened it?" Alistair cut him off, his gaze like flint. Kalen fell silent. "Has anyone in this room, with all your doctorates and your decades of experience, made that light turn green?" The silence was his answer. "Then let the girl try." He gestured to Maya. "Come here, child." Maria looked terrified, but Maya walked forward without hesitation, her small hand slipping into Alistair's. Her hand was warm, soft, a stark contrast to his own, which was cold and clammy with sweat. "What should I do?" she asked, looking up at him, her trust absolute. Alistair knelt down, so his eyes were level with hers, the expensive fabric of his suit creasing on the floor. He felt the gazes of the other men on him, a mixture of pity and contempt. Let them stare. Logic had failed him. It was time for a different kind of magic. "You said you tell your nightlight a secret," he said, his voice low. "Tell the safe a secret. Something you've never told anyone." Maya bit her lip, her small face scrunched in thought. Then she leaned forward, her lips close to the cool metal surface of the safe, right next to the biometric scanner. She cupped her hand around her mouth, as if sharing a great confidence. The room held its breath. The only sound was the faint hum of the ventilation system, and the pulsing of the red light, which seemed to cast an infernal glow on the little girl's face. She whispered something, her voice so soft that no one could hear the words. It was a long whisper, punctuated by small pauses and a little giggle. For a full minute, she spoke to the inanimate object, pouring her childish secrets into its metallic ear. When she finished, she patted the safe's door twice, a gesture of affection. "And its name is Penelope," she declared confidently. She turned to Alistair. "I think she likes that name." Nothing happened. The red light continued its steady, mocking pulse. The MIT expert sighed audibly. Kalen rubbed his temples, a look of profound weariness on his face. The moment of insane hope evaporated, leaving behind the bitter taste of foolishness. Alistair felt a crushing wave of disappointment. He had allowed himself to be swayed by a child's fantasy, and now he was just a madman in a suit, whispering to safes with a little girl. He had truly lost his mind. He was about to stand up, to dismiss everyone, and resign himself to his fate, when it happened. A soft chime, a pure, melodious note, echoed through the vault. It was a sound no one had heard before. The red light flickered, once, twice, and then it turned green, a brilliant emerald green. There was a faint hiss of depressurizing air, a series of clicks as unseen tumblers and locks disengaged, and then, with a low, hydraulic hum, the massive, meter-thick door of the Centurion began to swing inward, revealing the brightly lit interior of the vault. The room erupted. The experts gasped, their faces a mixture of shock and utter bewilderment. Kalen's jaw was slack, his professional composure completely shattered. Maria crossed herself, muttering a prayer in Spanish. Alistair just stared, his heart pounding against his ribs, not with panic, but with a wild, surging sense of disbelief and wonder. He looked from the open safe to the little girl standing beside him. Maya was smiling, a proud, happy smile. "See?" she said. She wasn't sad anymore. Alistair didn't move. He couldn't. He was frozen in place. caught in the vortex of the impossible. The assembled geniuses were babbling, theorizing, trying to retrofit a logical explanation onto an event that defied all logic. It must have been a system reset, a delayed command from our last algorithm, a temporal-based lockdown that just expired. But Alistair knew they were wrong. He had seen the girl whisper to the safe. He had heard the chime. He had seen the light change. It wasn't a glitch, and it wasn't a coincidence. It was something else, something ancient and primal that had no place in his world of cold, hard data. He slowly rose to his feet and walked towards the open vault. The digital key, a small obsidian thumb drive, was sitting on its pedestal, exactly where he had left it. His empire was safe. His fortune was secure. But as he reached for the key, his hand trembled. The victory felt hollow. He had been saved not by his power, his wealth, or his intellect, but by the simple, innocent faith of a 7-year-old child. He turned and looked at Maya, who was now being hugged tightly by her tearful grandmother. The men in the room were looking at her too, no longer with derision, but with a kind of fearful reverence, as if she were some sort of mystic. He dismissed them all with a wave of his hand. "Leave us," he commanded, his voice hoarse. "Everyone, out." Kalen hesitated. "Sir, the vault is open," Alistair finished for him. "Now get out." The room cleared quickly, the experts and security personnel melting away, leaving Alistair alone with Maria and her granddaughter. He walked over to them, his expensive shoes silent on the plush carpet. He knelt once more in front of Maya. "What did you tell her?" he asked, his voice soft. "What was the secret?" Maya looked at her grandmother, who gave a slight nod. "I told Penelope that sometimes I get scared at night," she said. "I told her that I miss my mommy. She works far away, on a big boat. And I told her that my favorite color is yellow, like the sun, and that I have a loose tooth." She opened her mouth to show him the wiggling incisor. "And then I told her the biggest secret. I told her that my abuela, my grandma, says that Mr. Blackwood is a good man, but he's very lonely, that he has a sad castle, and he needs a friend." Alistair felt the words like a physical blow. A sad castle. He looked around his penthouse, at the priceless art, the minimalist furniture, the vast, empty spaces. It was a masterpiece of modern architecture, a monument to success, and it was utterly, profoundly lonely. He had filled it with things, but not with life, not with warmth, not with love. Maria spoke, her voice trembling slightly. "I am so sorry, sir. I should not have spoken of you to the child." Alistair looked at Maria, truly looked at her for the first time in 10 years. He saw the deep lines of worry around her eyes, the kindness in her face, the fierce love she had for her granddaughter. She wasn't just staff. She was a person, with a life, a family, a heart that saw his loneliness. He felt a cracking deep within his chest, a breaking of a dam he had built around his emotions decades ago. A single tear traced a path down his cheek, hot and unfamiliar. He hadn't cried since he was a boy, since the day his own mother had left him at the orphanage gates with a promise to return that she never kept. "No, Maria," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. "You were right." He turned back to Maya. "The safe. It didn't open for me because of my thumbprint, or my voice. It needed something else, didn't it?" He was thinking out loud now, the pieces clicking into place in a way that defied logic, but felt profoundly true. The designer, Muller, he called the AI a sympathetic algorithm. It learns its owner. It mirrors them. Over the years, I closed myself off. I built walls. I became cold, hard, impenetrable. Just like this vault. The safe wasn't malfunctioning. It was reflecting me. It locked me out because I had locked the world out. I had locked myself out. He looked at the vast, empty apartment, and then at the warm, living presence of the child and her grandmother. It wasn't sad, he whispered, a revelation dawning in his eyes. It was lonely, just like me. The next few hours were a blur for Alistair. He made a single phone call to his second-in-command, a brief, terse conversation that stabilized the market and quelled the panic. His voice was calm, steady, the voice of a man in complete control. But inside, a revolution was taking place. He sent Kalen and the rest of his staff home for the day, a move so unprecedented that it caused more whispers than the morning's crisis. Then he did something even more out of character. He walked into his gleaming, state-of-the-art kitchen, a room usually only occupied by his personal chef, and asked Maria to show him how to make coffee. As the rich aroma filled the air, he sat at the breakfast nook with Maya, who was happily drawing a picture on a piece of high-grade corporate letterhead, with a set of colored pencils he'd had his assistant rush deliver. She was drawing a picture of the safe, Penelope, but this time it had a big, smiling face, and was surrounded by yellow suns. "Why did you name her Penelope?" Alistair asked, sipping the coffee, which Maria had mercifully made for him. "It's my mommy's name," Maya said, without looking up from her drawing. "It's a beautiful name, for a beautiful safe." The simple, unadorned sincerity of her words pierced him. He had spent his life acquiring beautiful things, but had he ever truly seen the beauty in any of them? Or were they just assets, items on a balance sheet, markers of his success? He had surrounded himself with value, but not with worth. He found himself telling them about his own childhood, a story he had never shared with anyone. He spoke of the orphanage, of the gnawing hunger, of the crushing loneliness. He spoke of his vow to become so rich and powerful that he would never be vulnerable again. He spoke of the mother he barely remembered, a woman whose face had faded over the years, leaving only a ghost of a memory and a lingering ache of abandonment. Maria listened with quiet sympathy, her hands wrapped around her own coffee mug. Maya, however, seemed to find nothing particularly tragic in his story. Children have a way of accepting the world as it is, without the layers of judgment and regret that adults accumulate. When he finished, his voice trailing off into a pained silence, Maya finally looked up from her drawing. "My mommy says that even when you're far away, you can still be in someone's heart," she said matter-of-factly. "Maybe your mommy is still in your heart. You just forgot to look there." Alistair stared at her. This 7-year-old child was dismantling his entire life's philosophy with a few simple sentences. He had spent 50 years building walls to protect his heart, and she had just walked right through them, as if they weren't even there. Later that afternoon, as Maria was preparing to leave, Alistair stopped her at the door. "Maria," he said, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant, "I would like to make a proposal, a new arrangement." He offered her a position not just as his head housekeeper, but as the manager of his entire domestic estate, with a salary that made her eyes widen in disbelief. But that wasn't the most important part. "And there's a condition," he added. "The apartment downstairs, the one I keep for guests, it's empty. I would like you and Maya to live there, rent-free, of course. I find the silence in this place to be oppressive, and I would very much like it if Maya would agree to have dinner with me. Every evening. Maria was speechless, tears welling in her eyes. Maya, however, beamed. "Can we have tacos?" she asked. Alistair, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, threw back his head and laughed. It was a real laugh, deep and genuine, a sound that startled him with its unfamiliarity. "We can have all the tacos in the world," he said. The transformation of Alistair Blackwood was not instantaneous. It was a slow, awkward process, like a frozen river thawing in the spring. The first few dinners were stilted affairs. Alistair, accustomed to power lunches and silent, solitary meals, struggled to make conversation with a 7-year-old. He would ask about her day at school, and she would give him a detailed, meandering account of playground politics and the profound injustice of having to eat broccoli. He, in turn, would try to explain his day, speaking of mergers and acquisitions, only to be met with a blank stare and the question, "But did you get to play on the swings?" Yet slowly, inexorably, the ice began to melt. Maya's presence was a constant, vibrant force of life in the sterile expanse of his penthouse. She left her toys in the living room, her colorful drawings on his minimalist refrigerator, her small, jam-smeared fingerprints on his glass tables. At first, it drove his obsessive-compulsive nature mad. He would follow her around, silently tidying up in her wake. But then he started to notice something. The mess wasn't chaos. It was life. The sterile perfection of his home had been a reflection of the emptiness of his soul. Maya was filling the spaces, both literally and figuratively. He started to look forward to their dinners, to her unfiltered view of the world. She taught him how to play Go Fish, a game he found both infuriatingly simple and surprisingly complex. She insisted on watching animated movies with him, and he found himself captivated by the simple stories of friendship and courage, stories that resonated with a part of him he thought had died long ago. He learned about her mother, Penelope, a merchant marine who was away at sea for months at a time. He saw the ache of her absence in Maya's eyes, and he recognized it as his own. One evening, as they were watching a movie about a lost puppy finding its way home, Maya snuggled up against him on the vast white sofa. "Are you still lonely, Mr. Alistair?" she asked, her voice sleepy. The question caught him off guard. He looked down at the small, warm weight against his side. He thought of the silence that no longer felt oppressive, of the laughter that now echoed in his halls, of the little girl who had somehow become the anchor of his life. "No, Maya," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm not lonely anymore." He also began to change at work. His employees noticed a shift in his demeanor. The ruthless, demanding titan of industry was still there, but he was tempered with something new: patience, empathy. He started asking about their families, remembering their children's names. He promoted a young, brilliant, single mother who he previously would have overlooked because of her divided attention. He started a foundation, pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into programs for underprivileged children, for orphans like him. He called it the Penelope Foundation. He never told anyone the significance of the name. It was a secret he kept, a silent tribute to the little girl and the safe that had changed his life. He even reconnected with Klaus Muller, the safe's designer. He flew to Munich, not to berate the man, but to understand. "The sympathetic algorithm," Alistair said, as they sat in Muller's workshop, surrounded by blueprints and prototypes. "Tell me about it." Muller, a proud, brilliant man, seemed almost embarrassed. It was an experiment, a folly. I was fascinated with the idea of emotional biometrics. The theory is that a truly secure system should recognize not just the physical identity of its owner, but their emotional and psychological state, their essence. The Centurion was designed to learn you, Mr. Blackwood, to attune itself to your very soul. When you became closed off, so did it. It was protecting your secrets in the only way it knew how, by reflecting your own impenetrability. It required not a key, but a connection, an act of pure, unguarded emotion, something you were no longer capable of giving it. Alistair nodded slowly. But a child could, he said softly. Yes, Muller agreed. A child who had not yet learned to build walls. A few months later, Alistair was in his office, looking over a proposal for a new children's hospital, when Maya came in. She was holding a small, slightly crumpled envelope. "This came for you," she said, handing it to him. The return address was a post office box in a port city he didn't recognize. The handwriting was neat and feminine. He opened it. Inside was a single photograph and a short handwritten letter. The photograph was of a woman with warm, smiling eyes and the same dark, curly hair as Maya. She was standing on the deck of a large container ship, the ocean vast and blue behind her. It was Penelope. The letter read, "Dear Mr. Blackwood, I don't know how to thank you. Maya tells me everything in her emails. She tells me you have become her best friend. She tells me she is not lonely anymore. For a mother who has to be so far away, there is no greater gift than knowing her child is safe and loved. You have taken care of my daughter, and in doing so, you have taken care of me. I will be home in 2 months. I cannot wait to meet the man who fixed my little girl's heart, and who, from the sounds of it, let her fix his. Yours, Penelope." Alistair read the letter twice, a slow smile spreading across his face. He looked at the picture of this woman he had never met, this woman whose name had inexplicably become a symbol of his own redemption. He felt a sense of connection, of anticipation, of a future he had never dared to imagine. A future filled not with assets and acquisitions, but with people, with family. That evening he took Maya down to the vault. The Centurion, or Penelope, as he now called it in his mind, stood silent and gleaming, the emerald green light a steady, reassuring presence. "I have something to show you," he said. He entered his code, a new one, a sequence of numbers that corresponded to Maya's birthday, and the door swung open. He led her inside. The vault was no longer just a repository for financial instruments. One wall was now covered in Maya's drawings, a riot of color in the sterile space. In the center of the room, on the main pedestal, the obsidian thumb drive was gone. In its place sat a small framed photograph. It was an old, faded black and white picture of a young woman with a sad smile, holding a small baby. "Is that you?" Maya asked, pointing to the baby. "Yes," Alistair said, his voice soft. "And that is my mother." It was the only picture he had of her, a picture he had kept hidden away for 50 years, a painful reminder of his abandonment. He had placed it here, in the heart of his empire, to remind himself of what truly mattered. Not the wealth it protected, but the love it had been built to replace. He had spent his life running from his past, from the lonely little boy in the orphanage. But now, thanks to another lonely little girl, he was finally ready to face him. He was finally ready to go home. The road to redemption was long and A-list. Air walked it with the small steady hand of a child guiding his way. He learned that true wealth wasn't stored in a vault, but in the connections we make, in the love we give and receive. He learned that the strongest walls are not made of steel and alloy, but of fear and pride. And he learned that sometimes the only key that can unlock a broken heart is a whispered secret from a child. The sad castle was no longer sad. It was a home, and the lonely king finally had a family. And it all started on the day his safe refused to open, the day his meticulously controlled world fell apart, only to be put back together again, in a way he never could have imagined, by a little girl who knew that even the hardest things in the world just need a little bit of love to open up. The 2 months leading up to Penelope's return were filled with a strange and wonderful newness for Alistair. He discovered the simple joys he had long since forgotten or had never known. He learned how to fly a kite in the park, a skill Maya taught him with the patient solemnity of a Zen master. He felt a thrill he hadn't experienced since his first hostile takeover as the cheap plastic diamond soared against the city skyline. He attended a parent-teacher conference with Maria, sitting on a comically small chair and listening to Mrs. Davison praise Maya's artistic talents and generous spirit. He felt a surge of pride so fierce it almost knocked him off the tiny chair. He even found himself in the toy aisle of a massive department store, a place he would have previously considered a circle of hell, earnestly debating the relative merits of 2 different brands of building blocks with Maya. He bought both. His world, once a monochrome landscape of black and red ink on financial statements, was now exploding with color. He found that he was a surprisingly good storyteller, weaving elaborate tales for Maya at bedtime, stories of brave knights and clever princesses, but also of lonely giants who learned to let people into their castles. He was, of course, the giant. Every story was a piece of his own fractured past, reshaped and healed through the telling. His relationship with Maria also deepened. They were no longer master and servant, but friends, allies, co-conspirators in the joyful project of raising Maya. He listened to her stories of her life in a small village in Mexico, of her journey to America, of the sacrifices she had made for her family. He saw in her a strength and resilience that dwarfed his own financial power. He realized that for 10 years, a woman of incredible substance and warmth had been living under his roof, and he had never bothered to see her. The thought shamed him, but it also filled him with a quiet determination to be better. The day Penelope's ship was due to dock, a palpable excitement filled the penthouse. Maya was practically vibrating with energy, changing her outfit 3 times before breakfast. Alistair found himself surprisingly nervous. He felt like a teenager preparing for a first date. He had constructed an image of this woman in his mind, from Maya's stories, Maria's reminiscences, and that single, smiling photograph. She was a figure of almost mythic proportions. What if she didn't like him? What if she saw him as the cold, arrogant billionaire he had been, and not the fumbling, kite-flying, storytelling man he was trying to become? He stood in front of his wardrobe for a full half-hour, an unprecedented display of sartorial indecision. His usual armor of bespoke suits felt wrong, too formal, too much like the old Alistair. On a whim, he chose a pair of simple trousers and a soft cashmere sweater. It was the most casual outfit he had worn in public in 30 years. He felt exposed, vulnerable, and strangely, wonderfully himself. They drove to the port in his Maybach, but the opulent car felt out of place amidst the grit and industry of the docks. As they waited at the terminal, Maya clutched his hand, her small fingers squeezing his with an intensity that betrayed her own nerves. Alistair knelt beside her. "It's going to be okay," he said, more to reassure himself than her. "She's going to be so happy to see you." And then he saw her. She was walking down the gangplank, a duffel bag slung over her shoulder, her eyes scanning the crowd with a fierce, searching intensity. She looked exactly like her photograph, but more real, more vibrant. Her smile wasn't just warm, it was radiant. Her eyes, the same deep brown as her daughter's, found them in the crowd. Maya let go of his hand and shot off like a rocket. "Mommy!" The cry was pure, unadulterated joy. Penelope dropped her bag and knelt, her arms open wide, catching her daughter in a hug that seemed to contain all the love in the world. Alistair watched them, a lump forming in his throat. He felt like an intruder on a sacred moment. He started to hang back to give them their space, but then Penelope looked up, her eyes meeting his over Maya's head. She smiled at him, a genuine, grateful smile, and beckoned him closer. He walked over, his heart thumping a nervous rhythm against his ribs. "You must be Alistair," she said, her voice warm and melodic, with a faint, lovely accent. "I'm Penelope. It's an honor to finally meet you." She extended a hand. He took it, and as their fingers touched, he felt a strange jolt, a sense of recognition, as if he were meeting someone he had known his entire life. The dinner that night was not in Alistair's grand, formal dining room, but in the cozy kitchen of Maria's downstairs apartment. The air was filled with the delicious smells of homemade tamales and the sound of laughter. Penelope was a natural storyteller, regaling them with tales of her adventures at sea, of navigating through fierce storms and seeing ports of call that Alistair had only ever read about in financial reports. She spoke of her work with a quiet pride and a deep competence that he found incredibly attractive. But most of all, she spoke of Maya. She listened with rapt attention, as Maya, with frequent interjections from Maria and Alistair, recounted the story of the safe. Penelope looked at Alistair, her eyes shining with a mixture of amusement and gratitude. "So my daughter and my namesake managed to crack the uncrackable man," she said, her tone teasing but her expression sincere. "I think the world owes you both a debt of gratitude." Alistair felt a blush creep up his neck, a sensation so foreign he barely recognized it. "I think the debt is all mine," he said quietly. After dinner, while Maria and Penelope were cleaning up, their conversation a happy, flowing river of Spanish, Alistair took Maya up to the penthouse to put her to bed. He read her a story, one of his own creations about a sea captain who searched the world for a treasure, only to find it waiting for him at home. As he tucked her in, she looked up at him, her eyes heavy with sleep. "I'm glad my mommy's home," she said, "but I'm also glad you're here. Now I have two best friends." She drifted off to sleep, a contented smile on her face. Alistair stood in the doorway for a long time, watching her. His heart felt so full, he thought it might burst. He had spent his life accumulating wealth, but he had never known richness like this. When he went back downstairs, Penelope was waiting for him on the small balcony, looking out at the glittering city lights. "She loves you, you know," Penelope said, without turning around. "She's a good judge of character." "She taught me how to have one," Alistair replied, standing beside her. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, the sounds of the city a distant hum below them. "Thank you, Alistair," Penelope said finally, her voice soft, "for everything. You gave my daughter a home when I couldn't. You gave her a family." "She gave me one, too," he said. He found himself telling her everything, just as he had told Maria and Maya. He told her about the orphanage, about his mother, about the loneliness that had been his constant companion for 50 years. She listened without judgment, her presence a warm, comforting balm on his old wounds. "You know," she said when he had finished, "the sea can be a lonely place, too. But the thing about the sea is, it connects everything. No matter how far apart two shores are, they're still touched by the same water. People are like that, too. We just sometimes forget." He looked at her kind, intelligent face, illuminated by the city lights, and he felt a sense of hope so powerful it was almost painful. He was an old man, set in his ways, a fortress of his own making. But Penelope and her daughter had shown him that even the strongest fortresses have gates, and that sometimes the most terrifying and beautiful thing in the world is to let someone else inside. In the months that followed, their little, unconventional family settled into a happy rhythm. Penelope, home for a long shore leave, became a regular presence in the penthouse. She and Alistair discovered a shared love for old movies and a competitive streak when it came to board games. He found himself falling in love, a slow, gentle, and terrifying process. It wasn't the fiery, acquisitive passion of his youth, but something quieter, deeper, more profound. It was a love built on shared laughter, quiet understanding, and the mutual adoration of a little girl with a wobbly tooth and a heart full of sunshine. One day, Alistair received a call from his second-in-command. A rival corporation was attempting a hostile takeover of a smaller family-owned company that Blackwood Industries had long been courting. The old Alistair would have relished the fight. He would have been ruthless, merciless, crushing the competition and absorbing the company into his empire. He would have seen it as just another win, another number on a balance sheet. He sat in his office, the battle plans laid out before him, the old, familiar predatory instincts stirring within him. But then he looked up and saw one of Maya's drawings taped to his wall. It was a picture of their family, him, Maya, Maria, and Penelope, all holding hands under a giant, smiling sun. He picked up the phone. "Call them off," he said, his voice firm. "We're not going after them. In fact, I want you to put together a proposal, a partnership. We'll help them grow, not devour them." His second-in-command was stunned into silence. Alistair hung up the phone, a sense of peace settling over him. He had spent his life building an empire. Now it was time to build a legacy not of power, but of kindness, a legacy not of wealth, but of worth, a legacy that a little girl could be proud of. That evening he took Penelope to the vault. He showed her the drawings, and he showed her the faded photograph of his mother. "This was the heart of my empire," he said, gesturing to the vault around them. "A cold, empty room filled with secrets. But it's not anymore." He took her hand. "Penelope, I have spent my entire life believing that love was a liability, that emotional connections were a weakness. I built this safe, this entire life, to protect myself from ever getting hurt again. But you and Maya, you didn't just open a safe. You opened me. You taught me that a real treasure isn't something you lock away. It's something you share." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a simple, elegant ring with a single, perfect yellow diamond. "I know I'm an old man, and I have a lot of catching up to do when it comes to being a human being," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "But I would be honored if you would help me, if you and Maya would be my family. For real." Tears streamed down Penelope's face as she threw her arms around his neck. "Yes," she whispered into his shoulder. "Yes, 1,000 times, yes." And in the heart of the billionaire's fortress, surrounded by a child's colorful drawings and the ghost of a long-lost mother, the lonely king finally found his queen, his empire of the heart finally complete. The wedding was a small, private affair, held not in some grand cathedral or opulent ballroom, but on the rooftop terrace of the penthouse, overlooking the city that had for so long been Alistair's kingdom of solitude. Maria stood as Penelope's matron of honor, her face beaming with a joy that was almost maternal. Maya was the flower girl, scattering yellow rose petals with a delightful seriousness, her dress a custom creation that matched the color of the diamond in her mother's ring. Alistair's best man was, to the shock of the business world, the CEO of the small company he had chosen to partner with instead of destroy. The man, a decent, hard-working father of 3, had been so moved by Alistair's unprecedented act of corporate grace that a genuine friendship had blossomed between them. It was a new kind of alliance for Alistair, one not forged in the crucible of profit and loss, but in the warmth of mutual respect. As he stood waiting for Penelope, Alistair looked out at the small gathering of guests. They were not the power players and sycophants who usually populated his social functions. They were Maria's family, Penelope's friends from her life at sea, the teachers from Maya's school, the director of the new children's hospital he was funding. It was a collection of good, ordinary people, the kind of people he had spent his life looking past, seeing them only as statistics or employees. Now he saw them as the intricate, vibrant threads that made up the fabric of a meaningful life. When Penelope walked down the petal-strewn aisle, he felt his breath catch in his throat. She wasn't wearing a traditional white gown, but a simple, elegant dress the color of the sea at dawn. She was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He had acquired priceless works of art, but none could compare to the masterpiece of kindness, strength, and love that was the woman walking towards him. They exchanged vows they had written themselves, promises not of ownership and acquisition, but of partnership, support, and shared adventure. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Maya let out a whoop of joy that echoed across the rooftop, and everyone laughed. It was a perfect moment, a symphony of love and happiness that Alistair had never thought he would be a part of. The reception was a joyful, chaotic affair. A mariachi band, hired by Maria as a surprise, played lively tunes that had everyone, even Alistair, dancing. He was clumsy, awkward, his feet unaccustomed to anything other than a confident boardroom stride. But with Penelope in his arms and Maya laughing at his side, he felt more graceful and powerful than he ever had. Later, as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the city, Alistair found himself standing with Maya by the edge of the terrace, watching the sky turn from orange to purple. "Are you happy?" Maya asked, her small hand finding his. "Yes," Alistair said, his voice thick with an emotion he could now easily identify as pure joy. Happier than I have ever been." "Me too," she said. "Now we're a real family." She leaned her head against his side, and together they watched the city lights begin to twinkle on. A constellation of human connections spread out before them. Alistair thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. It had started with a locked safe, a moment of pure panic and powerlessness. He had thought he was on the verge of losing everything, but in reality, he had been on the verge of gaining it all. He had been a man who had everything and nothing. He had a fortune that could move markets, but he had no one to share a meal with. He had a home that was the envy of the world, but it was filled with a crushing silence. He had built an empire of steel and glass, but his heart was a barren wasteland. The safe, Penelope the safe, hadn't been a malfunction. It had been an intervention, a desperate act by a sympathetic algorithm that had mirrored his own soul back at him and found it wanting. It had taken the innocent wisdom of a child to diagnose the problem not as a technical failure, but as a spiritual one. It wasn't a password or a biometric scan that was needed. It was a secret, an admission of vulnerability, an act of trust, a connection. Maya hadn't just given the safe a code. She had given him one. She had given him the key to unlock himself. As night fell and the party continued to swirl around them, a gentle, happy bubble of light and music in the vastness of the city, Alistair looked at his new wife, his new daughter, his extended family of friends, and he felt a profound sense of gratitude. He was no longer Alistair Blackwood, the Titan, the Shark, the Lonely King. He was just Alistair, a husband, a father, a friend, a man who had finally learned that the most valuable assets in the world could not be bought or sold, locked in a vault, or traded on an exchange. They were the intangible, immeasurable treasures of the human heart. And his vault, once a symbol of his isolation, was now the most precious place in the world, not because of the digital key it no longer held, but because of the faded photograph and the child's drawings it now protected. It was a testament to his transformation, a monument to a little girl who saw a sad, lonely machine, and taught a sad, lonely man how to open his heart. The red light of warning had become the green light of hope, and for Alistair Blackwood, the future was finally, brilliantly, open. If you were moved by Alistair's journey of rediscovery and the heartwarming power of simple human connection, please consider sharing this story with others. In a world that often measures success in numbers and possessions, stories like this remind us of the incredible, transformative wealth found in love, family, and opening our hearts. Your share could be the key that helps someone else unlock their own happiness. Thank you for reading.